Hello there, and welcome back to Sleepy Tin Foil Hat. Tonight, we are going to drift far back in time, farther than most stories ever go, to a place where history and legend blur together so completely that even experts are not always sure where one ends and the other begins. We will be traveling to ancient Mesopotamia, to the land between the rivers, where the very first cities rose from the earth, and where the earliest kings ruled over people who believed the gods walked among them. These were not ordinary rulers, at least not according to the records they left behind. Some of them were said to live for thousands of years. Some were chosen directly by the gods, and some ruled before a great flood that changed the world forever. Tonight, we are going to slowly explore the strange and mysterious stories of the Sumerian kings, their impossible lifespans, their forgotten cities, and the secrets hidden in one of the oldest documents ever discovered. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into forgotten history, make sure to subscribe to Sleepy Tin Foil Hat and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I always like seeing how far these stories travel in the night. But for now, there is nothing you need to do except relax. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow down. Let the day fade into the background as we step into a world that existed more than 5,000 years ago, long before empires, long before Rome, long before even the pyramids were built. A world where the first kings claimed their power came from the sky. The story of the Sumerian kings begins in a land that today lies mostly in modern Iraq, in the wide, flat plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In ancient times, this region was known as Mesopotamia, which simply means the land between the rivers. The soil there was rich, the water was steady, and the land was perfect for farming. Because of that, people settled there very early, and over time those settlements grew into the first true cities the world had ever seen. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, and Kish. These were not small villages. Some of them held tens of thousands of people, which was something completely new in human history. With cities came organization, and with organization came rulers. At first, these rulers may have been priests, or leaders chosen by the people, or perhaps the strongest warriors. But as time passed, the rulers became kings, and the kings became something more than human in the stories that were told about them. According to the ancient tablets, kingship itself was not invented by people. It was given to them. The Sumerians believed that kingship descended from heaven, as if it were a gift sent down by the gods to bring order to the world. One of the most fascinating things ever found by archaeologists is a clay tablet known today as the Sumerian King List. This ancient document was written thousands of years ago, copied again and again by scribes, and preserved in fragments that were eventually discovered buried in the ruins of old cities. The King List does something very unusual. It names the kings who ruled in the earliest times, and it tells how long each one ruled. But the numbers written on that list do not sound like normal history. Some kings ruled for hundreds of years. Some ruled for thousands. And the very first kings on the list were said to rule for lengths of time that seem almost impossible. The list begins with a line that feels more like mythology than history. It says that after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu was one of the oldest cities in Sumer, and the people who lived there believed it was the first city ever created. According to their traditions, it was founded by the gods themselves, and it was protected by a powerful deity named Enki, who was known as the god of wisdom, water, and creation. In the king list, the first ruler of Eridu is a king named Alulim, and he is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. When modern readers first see that number, it sounds impossible, almost like a mistake. No human could live that long. Even the longest human lives recorded in modern times do not come close to that. But the strange thing is that the king list continues in the same way. The next king, Al-Algar, is said to have ruled for 36,000 years. After him come other kings with reigns of 43,200 years, 28,800 years, and more. These numbers repeat again and again, always far beyond what we would expect from normal history. Because of this, many researchers believe the earliest part of the king list is not meant to be taken literally. Instead, they think these long lifespans may have been symbolic or connected to ancient ways of counting time that we no longer understand. Some scholars believe the numbers may have been based on a different calendar. Others think they were meant to show that these kings belonged to a special age, a time closer to the gods, when the world itself was different. There is another detail in the king list that makes the story even more mysterious. After several of these early kings are listed, the text suddenly says that the flood swept over the land. After the flood had swept over, kingship again descended from heaven. This single line has fascinated historians for generations because it sounds very similar to flood stories that appear in many ancient cultures, including the story of Noah in the Bible and the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The idea that there was a great flood long ago appears again and again in ancient myths from different parts of the world. In Mesopotamia, the flood story was especially important, and it was connected to the idea that the world before the flood was not the same as the world after it. In the king list, the kings before the flood lived for incredibly long periods of time, but after the flood, the lifespans become much shorter, closer to what we would expect from real human rulers. It is almost as if the flood marked the end of an older age, a time when people were closer to the divine. After the flood, the king list says that kingship was given to the city of Kish. This is where the list begins to sound more like history and less like myth. The kings of Kish still sometimes rule for long periods, but the numbers begin to shrink. Instead of tens of thousands of years, we start to see reigns of hundreds, then dozens. It feels as if the story is slowly moving from legend into reality, as if the scribes who wrote the list were trying to connect their own time to a much older and more mysterious past. The Sumerians believed very strongly that their kings were chosen by the gods. A king was not just a political leader, he was a link between heaven and earth. He performed rituals, made offerings, and spoke to the gods on behalf of the people. If the king was strong and wise, the land would prosper. If the king failed, the gods might send drought, famine, or war. Because of this, the idea that kingship came from heaven was not just a story, it was the foundation of their entire world. Some researchers have wondered whether the long lifespans in the king list could represent dynasties instead of individuals, or whether the numbers were written using a system based on sacred mathematics. In Mesopotamia, numbers like 60, 360, and multiples of them were considered special. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, which is why we still divide time into 60 minutes and 60 seconds today. When the lifespans in the king list are studied carefully, many of them turn out to be exact multiples of these sacred numbers, which makes the list feel less random and more intentional. Another possibility that some people like to imagine, especially those who enjoy ancient mysteries, is that the stories might preserve memories of something we no longer fully understand. Maybe the early kings were not exactly human, at least not in the way we think of humans today. The Sumerians themselves wrote about beings called the Anunnaki, powerful figures who were said to come from the heavens and teach people knowledge. In later myths, these beings helped shape civilization itself, showing humans how to build cities, write laws, and worship the gods. Whether these stories were meant as symbolism, religion, or something else entirely is still debated. What makes the Sumerian king list so fascinating is that it sits right on the edge between myth and history. It is not purely a legend, because real cities and real rulers appear in it. But it is not purely history either, because the earliest parts sound like something from a dream, or from a time when people believed the world worked very differently than it does now. As we continue this journey, we will move slowly through the ages of these ancient kings, exploring the rulers who were said to live before the flood, the kings who rebuilt civilization after the waters fell, and the strange stories that survived on clay tablets for thousands of years, waiting to be read again in a world that almost forgot them. And the deeper we go into the list, the stranger the story becomes, because some of these kings were not only rulers of cities, but figures who appear in myths, epics, and legends that still echo today, as if their names were never meant to disappear completely. As the story of the Sumerian kings continues, the world after the Great Flood feels quieter, more familiar, but still filled with strange details that make it clear the people who wrote these records believed they were living much closer to the beginning of time than we are today. According to the king list, once the flood had swept over the land, kingship was given again from heaven, and this time it was given to the city of Kish. Kish became one of the most important cities in early Mesopotamia, and for a long time it was believed that whoever ruled Kish had the right to call himself king of the whole land. The first king of Kish listed after the flood is named Jusha, and unlike the kings before the flood, his reign is measured in hundreds of years instead of tens of thousands. Even so, the numbers are still much larger than what we would expect from real human lifetimes. Jusha is said to have ruled for 1,200 years. After him comes another king, Kulasina-Bel, whose name may not even be a personal name at all. Some historians think the name could mean something like, all of them were Lord, which makes it sound less like one person and more like a memory of a time when leadership was shared or unclear. As the list goes on, the reigns continue to grow shorter, but they are still long enough to make you pause and wonder how the scribes who wrote these tablets understood time. One king is said to rule for 960 years, another for 840, another for 720. The numbers repeat in patterns that seem deliberate, often connected to the base 60 system the Sumerians used for counting. Because of that, some scholars believe these numbers may have been a way of showing importance rather than actual years, as if the longer the reign, the more powerful or legendary the king was believed to be. What makes the king list especially interesting is that it does not follow a simple line from one king to the next. Instead, it moves from city to city. One city holds kingship for a time, then the gods decide to give kingship to another city. This idea tells us a lot about how the Sumerians saw the world. They did not think power came from armies alone. They believed power was something the gods allowed, something that could be taken away at any moment and given to someone else. If a city fell, it meant the gods had chosen a new place for kingship to live. After Kish, the list tells us that kingship passed to the city of Iana, which was part of the great city of Uruk. Uruk is one of the most famous cities in all of ancient history. It was huge for its time, surrounded by thick walls, filled with temples, workshops, and houses, and home to thousands of people. Many historians believe Uruk may have been the first true city in the world, the first place where human life became fully organized into something we would recognize as civilization. It is in Uruk that we meet one of the most famous names in the entire king list, a name that appears not only in historical records, but also in one of the oldest stories ever written. That name is Gilgamesh. According to the king list, Gilgamesh was the fifth king of Uruk, and his reign is said to have lasted 126 years. Compared to the thousands of years given to the kings before the flood, this number feels almost realistic, yet Gilgamesh himself is anything but ordinary. The story of Gilgamesh survives in a long poem known today as the Epic of Gilgamesh, written on clay tablets in cuneiform script. In that story, Gilgamesh is described as a powerful king, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His mother was said to be a goddess, and his strength was beyond that of any normal man. He built the great walls of Uruk, fought monsters, traveled to distant lands, and searched for the secret of eternal life. Even though the epic is full of myth and fantasy, the fact that Gilgamesh also appears in the king list makes people wonder if there really was a king long ago whose life inspired these stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh also contains another version of the Great Flood story, one that sounds strangely familiar to anyone who has heard the story of Noah. In the epic, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the gods that a flood will destroy the world. He builds a great boat, saves animals and his family, and survives while the rest of humanity is wiped away. After the flood, he is given immortality by the gods. The similarities between this story and later flood stories have made many historians believe that these ancient Mesopotamian tales may be the oldest versions we have, passed down and changed over thousands of years. As we move through the king list, the world begins to feel less like myth and more like history, but the strange atmosphere never fully disappears. The kings become more human, yet the belief that they ruled by the will of the gods remains strong. Each time kingship moves to a new city, it feels almost like a ritual, as if the scribes wanted to show that order in the world depended on a balance between heaven and earth. After Uruk, kingship passes to the city of Ur, another place that would become one of the greatest centers of Sumerian culture. Ur was known for its massive temples, its skilled craftsmen, and its great ziggurat, a towering stepped structure built to honor the gods. The kings of Ur are listed with reigns that are shorter again, sometimes only a few decades, which makes them feel closer to the rulers we know from later history. This gradual change in the length of reigns is one of the most interesting patterns in the entire king list. At the beginning, the kings live for impossibly long times, as if they belong to a world that followed different rules. After the flood, the numbers shrink, slowly, step by step, until the kings seem almost normal. Some researchers think this pattern was meant to show that the world itself had changed, that the earliest age was closer to the divine, and that over time, humanity became more ordinary. The idea of a golden age followed by decline appears in many ancient cultures. The Greeks spoke of an age of gods, then heroes, then ordinary men. In some traditions, people once lived for hundreds of years, but their lifespans grew shorter as the world moved farther away from its beginning. The Sumerian king list seems to follow the same pattern, as if the scribes believed they were living at the end of a long story that started in a time when humans and gods were not so far apart. Another detail that makes the king list feel mysterious is the way it mixes real places with legendary events. Cities like Kish, Uruk, and Ur really existed. Their ruins can still be seen today. Clay tablets from those cities show that kings ruled there, built temples, fought wars, and traded with distant lands. Yet in the same list, those real cities are connected to rulers who lived for thousands of years and to a flood that wiped the world clean. It is as if the people who wrote the list did not see a sharp line between myth and history. To them, both were part of the same story. As the centuries passed, the Sumerian world became more crowded, more complex, and more competitive. Cities fought each other for power, and kings tried to prove that the gods had chosen them above all others. The king list may have been written partly to show that the current ruler stood in a line that stretched all the way back to the beginning of civilization. By linking themselves to the first kings, they were not just claiming power, they were claiming destiny. And as we continue deeper into the list, the names of the kings begin to sound less like figures from legend and more like men who may have actually walked the streets of these ancient cities, men who built temples, led armies, and tried to hold together a world that was still young, still uncertain, and still filled with the feeling that the gods were watching everything that happened. As the king list moves forward through the ages, the world of the Sumerians begins to feel more solid, more grounded, but never completely free from mystery. The names of the kings become easier to imagine as real people, rulers who lived in cities made of mud, brick, and stone, who walked through temple courtyards, listened to priests, and commanded soldiers. Yet even in this more human period, the belief that kingship came from the heavens never disappears. Every ruler, no matter how ordinary he might seem to us, was believed to hold his power because the gods allowed it. And that idea shaped everything about how the Sumerians understood history. After the time of Ur and Uruk, the king list continues to shift kingship from one city to another, as if the authority to rule the world was something that moved like the seasons. One city would rise, another would fall, and the scribes recorded these changes as if they were part of a pattern decided long ago. This way of writing history feels different from the way we tell stories today. Instead of focusing only on battles or events, the king list focuses on who held kingship and where the gods had chosen for it to live. One of the cities that becomes important during this part of the list is Lagash. Lagash was not the first city in Sumer, but it became one of the strongest. The ruins of Lagash have given archaeologists many tablets, statues, and inscriptions, more than almost any other early city. Because of that, Lagash feels less like a legend and more like a real place where real people lived. We know the names of its rulers, we know the temples they built, and we even know some of the laws they made. One of the most famous rulers connected to Lagash is a king named Ur-Nanshe. Unlike the kings from the earliest part of the list, Ur-Nanshe does not rule for thousands of years. His reign is measured in decades, and his name appears not only in the king list, but also on carvings and stone reliefs that still exist today. On one of those carvings, he is shown carrying a basket of bricks on his head, helping to build a temple. This image tells us something important about how kings were seen in Sumer. A king was not only a warrior, he was also a builder, a servant of the gods, someone who helped create order in the world. The Sumerians believed that building temples was one of the most important duties a king could perform. Each city had its own main god, and the temple was considered the home of that god on earth. If the temple was strong and beautiful, it meant the city was under divine protection. If the temple fell into ruin, people believed the gods might abandon the city. Because of that, kings spent enormous effort on construction, making temples larger, taller, and more impressive with each generation. As we read the king list, it becomes clear that the scribes were not just recording facts. They were telling a story about order and chaos, about the rise and fall of cities, and about the idea that the world only stayed stable when the gods allowed it. When one city lost kingship and another gained it, the text does not explain why in detail. It simply says that kingship was taken to a new place, as if the decision happened somewhere beyond human understanding. Another ruler whose name appears in the records is Eannatum of Lagash, a king who lived during a time when the cities of Sumer often fought each other. Unlike the earliest kings, who seem almost peaceful in the list, Eannatum is remembered for war. Inscriptions found in Lagash describe battles against neighboring cities, especially the city of Umma. These conflicts were not small. They were struggles for land, water, and control of the fertile fields that made life possible in Mesopotamia. One of the most famous objects from this time is called the Stele of the Vultures, a carved stone monument that shows soldiers marching in formation, carrying spears and shields, while vultures fly overhead. The carving tells the story of a victory by Lagash over Umma, and it shows something new in history. For the first time, we see war recorded not as myth, but as an event that really happened, with real armies and real consequences. Even in these more realistic records, the gods are never far away. The inscriptions say that the victory was not only because of the king's strength, but because the god Ningirsu supported Lagash. The king is described almost like a chosen instrument, someone who acts on behalf of the divine. This idea appears again and again in Sumerian writing. A king does not rule alone. He rules with the approval of heaven, and if that approval is lost, his power can disappear just as quickly as it came. As the centuries pass in the king list, the pattern becomes clearer. Cities rise, kings rule, temples are built, wars are fought, and then kingship moves on. Sometimes it returns to a city that held it before, as if history is circling rather than moving in a straight line. This circular feeling gives the list a strange, almost dreamlike quality, as if the scribes believed the world followed a rhythm that repeated again and again. One of the reasons the king list feels so unusual is that it tries to connect two very different kinds of memory. On one side, there are myths about ancient times, floods, and kings who lived for thousands of years. On the other side, there are real records of rulers who built walls, dug canals, and fought over farmland. Instead of separating these two things, the Sumerians placed them together in one long story, as if everything that had ever happened belonged to the same timeline. This way of thinking may explain why the earliest kings are described as almost superhuman. To the people who lived thousands of years later, the first age of the world must have felt very far away, almost like a different reality. Just as we sometimes imagine the distant past as a time of giants or heroes, the Sumerians imagined their earliest kings as beings who lived longer, ruled longer, and stood closer to the gods. Another possibility, which some researchers like to think about, is that the long lifespans were not meant to describe years the way we count them today. The Sumerians used different calendars at different times, and their number system was based on 60 instead of 10. Because of that, the numbers on the king list may represent something symbolic or something ritual rather than literal lifetimes. But even if the numbers are symbolic, the fact that the scribes wrote them down with such care shows that they believed the past was deeper and stranger than the present. As we continue through the king list, the world of Sumer grows more crowded, with names we can almost recognize as historical. The kings become less like figures from legend and more like rulers who lived in cities we can still find on a map. Yet the feeling of mystery never fully disappears, because the list keeps reminding us that, according to the Sumerians, every king who ever ruled was part of a chain that began when kingship first descended from heaven. And the further we go into that chain, the more we begin to see that the Sumerian kings were not only leaders of people, but symbols of something much larger, something that connected the earth, the sky, and the idea that civilization itself was a gift that could appear, disappear, and appear again, depending on the will of the gods. As the story of the Sumerian kings continues to unfold, the world begins to feel more familiar, yet at the same time more fragile, as if the people living in those ancient cities believed that everything they had built could disappear at any moment. The king list keeps repeating the same pattern, almost like a quiet rhythm in the background of history. A city is given kingship. A ruler holds power for a time. Then something changes, and kingship is taken away and given to another place. The text rarely explains why. It simply states that it happened, as if the decision was made somewhere beyond the reach of human understanding. By this point in the list, the names of the kings and cities begin to match more closely with archaeological discoveries, which makes this part of the story feel less like myth and more like a distant memory of real events. Yet even here, the Sumerians never stopped describing kingship as something sacred. No matter how many wars are fought or how many cities rise and fall, the idea remains the same. Kingship does not belong to men alone. It belongs to the gods, and it is only loaned to humans for a time. One of the cities that becomes important during this period is Adab, a place that does not appear as often in modern discussions, but was clearly significant to the people who wrote the king list. When kingship is said to move to Adab, the list names a ruler called Lugal-an-Mundu. His name is not as well known today as Gilgamesh, but the records about him are intriguing. Later inscriptions claim that Lugal-an-Mundu ruled over a vast territory, stretching far beyond a single city. Some texts even suggest that his influence reached across much of Mesopotamia, and perhaps beyond it. When historians read these claims, they often wonder how much is true and how much is exaggeration. Ancient rulers like to describe their victories in the grandest possible way. A king might defeat one neighboring city and then write that he ruled the whole world. But even if the stories are exaggerated, they tell us something important about how these kings saw themselves. They did not think of their rule as small or local. They believed they were part of a much larger story, one that connected their city to the entire order of the world. As time passes in the king list, the changes between cities begin to happen more quickly. Kingship moves from Adab to Mari, from Mari to Kish again, then to other cities whose names appear and disappear like echoes. Each change reminds us that early Mesopotamia was not one united kingdom, but a collection of powerful city-states, each with its own temple, its own god, and its own ruler. Sometimes these cities traded with each other. Sometimes they fought. And sometimes one city became strong enough to claim that the gods had chosen it above all others. The city of Mari, which appears in the list during this period, was located farther to the west, near the middle of the Euphrates River. Mari became an important center of trade, connecting the cities of Sumer to lands far away. Tablets found in its ruins show that merchants traveled long distances, carrying goods like copper, wood, stone, and precious metals. In a land where good building materials were rare, trade was essential, and the kings who controlled the trade routes could become very powerful. When the king list says that kingship moved to Mari, it may reflect a time when that city became strong enough to dominate its neighbors. But instead of describing this as a simple political victory, the scribes wrote it in a different way. They said kingship was taken to Mari, as if the gods themselves had decided that the city deserved to rule. This way of writing history makes every change feel larger than life, as if human events were only the visible part of something happening on a higher level. Another city that appears again and again in the list is Kish. Even after losing kingship, Kish seems to return to power more than once. Some historians think this means Kish held a special status among the Sumerians. In later times, rulers from other cities would sometimes call themselves King of Kish, even if they did not live there. The title may have become a symbol of authority, a way of saying that a ruler had the right to lead all of Sumer, not just his own city. This idea tells us something about how the Sumerians thought about legitimacy. It was not enough to be strong. A king also had to be recognized as rightful, and that rightfulness came from tradition, from religion, and from the belief that the gods approved of his rule. The king list may have been written partly to show that the current ruler stood in a line that went all the way back to the first kings, the ones who lived before the flood, when kingship first descended from heaven. As the centuries move forward, we begin to see more evidence of real history blending into the list. We find names of kings who appear not only in the king list, but also in inscriptions carved on stone or pressed into clay. These rulers built canals, repaired temples, and fought wars that left marks in the ground that can still be seen today. Yet even when the records become more realistic, the old beliefs never disappear. Every king still presents himself as chosen by the gods, protected by the gods, and sometimes even related to the gods. One of the most interesting things about this period is how the idea of the king begins to change. In the earliest part of the list, the kings seem almost like mythological beings, living for thousands of years and ruling in a world that feels half divine. In the later part, the kings are clearly human, but they still carry a kind of sacred authority. They perform rituals, offer sacrifices, and act as the link between the people and the unseen powers that were believed to control the world. The Sumerians did not separate religion from politics the way we often do today. For them, the two were the same. A king who failed to honor the gods could bring disaster on the entire city. A king who pleased the gods could bring prosperity, good harvests, and peace. Because of that, every victory and every defeat was seen as a sign of divine favor or divine anger. As we follow the king list further, the names continue, one after another, forming a chain that stretches across centuries. Some kings rule for many years, some for only a short time, and some seem to appear only briefly before kingship moves on again. The list does not pause to explain every detail. It moves forward steadily, as if the scribes who copied it believed the pattern itself was more important than the individual stories. And yet, behind those short lines of text, we can imagine the lives of the people who lived under those kings. Farmers working in the fields beside the rivers, priests lighting fires in the temples, builders stacking bricks under the hot sun, soldiers marching out to fight for land and water. All of them living in a world where the past felt very close, where the first kings were remembered as almost divine, and where every ruler believed that his place in history had been decided long before he was born. The deeper we go into the list, the more it feels like we are watching the slow transformation of the world itself, from an age of legend into an age of memory, from a time when kings lived for thousands of years into a time when their lives became shorter, their struggles more human, and their stories closer to the kind of history we think we understand. But even as the numbers shrink and the records become clearer, the king list keeps reminding us that, in the minds of the Sumerians, the line between myth and history was never completely gone, and that every king, no matter how ordinary he seemed, was still part of a story that began when the first rulers were said to have come down from the sky. As the Sumerian king list continues, the steady rhythm of rising and falling cities begins to feel almost like the turning of a great wheel, slow and inevitable. One city holds kingship for a time, builds its temples, strengthens its walls, and believes that its power will last forever. Then, without much explanation, the list tells us that kingship was taken away and given to another city. To the people who lived in those ancient times, this was not just politics. It was the natural order of the world, guided by forces far beyond human control. By this point in the list, the rulers begin to feel more and more like real historical kings rather than legendary figures. Their reigns are shorter, their cities are better known, and the events connected to them leave traces that archaeologists can still study today. Yet the strange atmosphere never disappears completely, because the scribes who recorded these names still believed they were writing part of a story that began before the flood, when the first kings ruled for thousands of years and walked closer to the gods than any human could now. One of the cities that becomes powerful during this later period is Akshak, a place that appears only briefly in the king list, but seems to have held importance for a time. When kingship is said to move to Akshak, the ruler named is Unzi, followed by a few others whose reigns are listed with the same careful attention as those who came before. The list does not describe what these kings did or how they gained power. It simply states that they ruled and that their time eventually ended. This simple way of writing history gives the list a quiet, almost dreamlike feeling, as if the details were less important than the pattern itself. After Akshak, kingship returns once again to Kish, and this return feels significant, as if the scribes wanted to remind the reader that Kish still held a special place in the memory of Sumer. The kings of Kish during this time have names that appear in other records as well, which makes this part of the list feel closer to the world that historians can confirm. Yet even here, the idea that kingship moves according to divine will remains unchanged. The text never says that one king conquered another because of strategy or luck. Instead, it says that kingship was given or taken as if the decision happened in the heavens first and only later appeared on earth. It is during this later age that the world of Sumer becomes more crowded with rival cities, each trying to prove that it was the rightful center of power. Cities like Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Adab, and Kish all competed for land and influence. The fertile plains between the rivers could support many people, but they also created conflict because water and farmland were always precious. Canals had to be dug and maintained, fields had to be protected, and boundaries had to be defended. A strong king could keep order. A weak king could lose everything. Because of this, the role of the king became even more important. He was not only the servant of the gods, but also the protector of the city. He led armies, settled disputes, and made sure the canals stayed clear so the crops would grow. If the harvest failed, people might believe the king had angered the gods. If enemies attacked, people might believe the gods had withdrawn their protection. In this way, every event in daily life could be connected back to the ruler and his relationship with the divine. One of the most interesting things about this period is how often the king list shows kingship moving back and forth between the same cities. It is almost as if no city could hold power forever. Even the strongest would eventually lose favor, and another would rise in its place. This idea may have been comforting in a strange way. If power could be lost, it could also be regained. If a city had once held kingship, it might hold it again. As the list continues, the names begin to sound more familiar to historians because they belong to the time when written records become more common. Clay tablets from this era show that the Sumerians kept careful accounts of trade, laws, and temple offerings. They wrote down contracts, recorded harvests, and even kept lists of workers and supplies. The invention of writing had changed everything. It allowed people to remember details that would otherwise be forgotten, and it made history feel more solid, less like a story and more like a record. Even so, the king list never becomes a simple list of facts. It always keeps the same tone, the same sense that something larger is happening behind the scenes. Every time kingship moves, the text reminds us that it was not just a human decision. It was something that happened because the order of the world required it. During this time, another powerful city begins to rise, and its name appears again and again in both the king list and in real inscriptions found by archaeologists. That city is Uruk, the same place connected to Gilgamesh in the earlier part of the story. Uruk had been important before, but now it becomes powerful again, showing how the wheel of kingship could turn and return to places that had once ruled long ago. The kings of Uruk during this later period seem more human than the legendary rulers of the earliest age, yet they still carry an air of greatness. They build temples, lead armies, and leave behind inscriptions that describe their victories. Some of these inscriptions speak of distant lands, long journeys, and battles fought far from home. They give the feeling that the world of Sumer was expanding, that the cities along the rivers were no longer isolated, but connected to a wider world full of other peoples and other kingdoms. As the world grows larger, the stories of the kings grow more complex. Instead of simply ruling one city, some kings claim authority over many. Instead of fighting only their neighbors, they travel farther, seeking trade, alliances, or conquest. The king list reflects this change by showing kingship moving more often, as if the balance of power was harder to hold than before. Yet even with all these changes, the old belief never fades. The Sumerians still see their history as part of a long chain that began when kingship first came down from heaven. No matter how human the kings become, they are still connected to that beginning, still part of the same story that includes the flood, the ancient cities, and the rulers who lived for thousands of years. And as we continue deeper into the list, we begin to approach a time when the world of Sumer will change again, when new rulers will appear who try not only to hold kingship, but to unite many cities under one power, creating something larger than any kingdom that had existed before, and leaving behind records that make the story feel closer than ever to the kind of history we think we know. As the Sumerian king list moves further into the later ages, the pattern of shifting kingship begins to speed up, almost as if the world itself is becoming more restless. The cities that once held power for long stretches now seem to rise and fall more quickly, and the names of the kings pass by faster, one after another, like footprints in wet clay that slowly dry and harden into history. Yet even as the list becomes more grounded in what feels like real events, the same quiet message continues underneath it all. Kingship does not belong to any one city forever. It moves when the time comes, because the gods allow it to move. By this point, the world of Sumer is no longer a small collection of settlements along the rivers. It has become a network of powerful cities, each with its own ruler, its own temple, and its own ambitions. Trade connects them, but so does rivalry. The fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates can support many people, yet it also creates constant tension, because whoever controls the water controls life itself. Canals must be dug, fields must be defended, and borders must be watched. A king who could keep order was seen as blessed. A king who failed risked losing everything, not only to enemies, but to the belief that the gods had turned against him. During this period, one of the cities that begins to stand out again is Ur. Ur had already appeared earlier in the king list, but now it rises once more, showing how power in Mesopotamia often returned to places that had once been strong. The ruins of Ur, which still stand today as great mounds of earth and broken brick, tell us that this city was one of the most important in the ancient world. Its ziggurat, a massive step temple built to honor the moon god Nana, towered above the city like a mountain made by human hands. The kings of Ur during this later age are easier to imagine as real rulers. Their reigns are counted in years that sound possible, and their names appear not only in the king list, but also in inscriptions carved on stone and written on clay tablets. These kings built walls, repaired temples, organized trade, and led armies when needed. Yet even though their lives feel more human, the belief that their authority came from heaven never disappears. Every inscription still speaks of the gods, of divine favor, and of the duty of the king to keep the world in balance. As the centuries pass, another city begins to grow in importance, and its rise marks a change in the way power is understood. That city is Akkad. Unlike the older Sumerian cities, Akkad does not appear in the earliest parts of the king list. It belongs to a later time, when new rulers began to dream of something larger than a single city-state. Instead of simply holding kingship for one city, they wanted to rule many cities at once, to create a kingdom that stretched across the land between the rivers. The most famous ruler connected to this change is a king known as Sargon of Akkad. His name does not appear in the earliest copies of the king list, but later versions include him, and other records speak of him as one of the greatest rulers of the ancient world. According to the stories told about him, Sargon did not come from a royal family. Some legends say he was born in secret, placed in a basket, and set adrift on a river, where he was found and raised by a gardener. The story sounds familiar, almost like other ancient tales where a child of destiny begins life in danger before rising to power. Whether the story is true or not, Sargon became a ruler unlike those who came before him. Instead of ruling only one city, he conquered many, creating what some historians call the first empire in history. His armies traveled far beyond the old borders of Sumer, and his name became known across a wide land. In the records written by his scribes, he is described as chosen by the gods, protected by the goddess Ishtar, and destined to rule over all the lands between the sunrise and the sunset. The rise of Sargon marks a moment when the world described in the king list begins to feel very close to what we think of as history. The kings are no longer half-legendary figures with impossible lifespans. They are rulers whose actions leave marks in the ground, in the ruins of cities, and in the tablets that survive thousands of years later. Yet even here, the old ideas remain. Sargon does not claim power only because of strength. He claims it because the gods wanted him to rule. This mixture of myth and reality is what makes the Sumerian king list so unusual. It does not separate the two. To the people who wrote it, the past was one long story, beginning in a time when kings lived for thousands of years, passing through the flood, moving through the rise of cities, and continuing into the age of empires. Everything belonged to the same chain, and every king, no matter how human he seemed, was part of that chain. After Sargon, the king list continues with the rulers who followed him, and we see the same pattern again. Power grows, reaches its height, and then begins to weaken. The empire of Akkad becomes strong, then struggles, then fades, and kingship moves once more. The text does not describe every battle or every problem. It simply tells us that kingship was taken somewhere else, as if the balance of the world had shifted again. This idea that power rises and falls according to a larger order appears again and again in ancient writing. The Sumerians believed that the world had a structure, a kind of hidden plan, and that the gods kept that plan in motion. Cities could grow proud, kings could become powerful, but nothing lasted forever. Sooner or later, the wheel would turn, and kingship would move on. As we continue through the list, the names become more familiar to historians, the dates become easier to place, and the story begins to feel closer to the world we know. Yet the deeper meaning never changes. Every ruler is still part of the same ancient tradition, the same belief that kingship first descended from heaven long ago, before the flood, when the first cities were young and the line between humans and gods was not yet so far apart. And as the list moves forward, we begin to approach the final ages of Sumerian power, a time when the old cities will struggle to hold their place in a changing world, and when the memory of the first kings will start to feel less like history and more like something distant and sacred, a reminder of an age when the world itself seemed larger, stranger, and closer to the sky. As the Sumerian king list continues into the later ages, the world it describes feels more familiar than ever before, yet at the same time more uncertain, as if the balance that once held the cities together is beginning to weaken. The great rulers of earlier times had built temples, dug canals, and claimed the favor of the gods, but now the list begins to move more quickly, and kingship changes hands more often. It is as if the world itself has become harder to hold steady, and the cities that once believed they would last forever are starting to realize that nothing in this world remains in one place for long. After the time of Sargon and the kings of Akkad, the land of Mesopotamia entered a period that must have felt confusing and unstable to the people who lived through it. The empire that Sargon created had stretched farther than any kingdom before it, but after his death, it did not stay strong forever. His descendants ruled for a time, but the records tell of revolts, invasions, and struggles to keep control. The king list reflects this in its own quiet way. Instead of long, steady reigns, we begin to see shorter ones, and the movement of kingship becomes more frequent. The scribes who copied the king list did not describe these changes with long explanations. They simply wrote that kingship was taken away and given somewhere else. Yet behind those simple words, we can imagine the reality of what must have happened. Cities fighting for control, armies marching across the plains, farmers caught between rulers, priests praying for the favor of the gods. In the world of Sumer, every political change was also a religious event. because if a king lost power, it meant the gods had chosen differently. During this time, the king list tells us that kingship moved again to the city of Uruk, then to Ur, and then to other cities that had already appeared earlier in the story. This repeating pattern makes the list feel almost like a circle, as if history was not moving forward in a straight line, but turning again and again through the same places. The same cities rise, fall, and rise again, each time believing that their rule will last longer than the last. One of the things that makes this period especially interesting is that we begin to see clearer evidence of real historical rulers whose names appear both in the king list and in tablets found by archaeologists. These kings did not live for thousands of years, and their stories are not filled with monsters or divine journeys, but they still believed their power came from the same source as the legendary kings of the past. The city of Ur becomes important again during this time, and its rulers leave behind records that show how organized and complex the world of Sumer had become. There were scribes who kept careful accounts, officials who managed supplies, workers who built temples and canals, and priests who performed rituals to keep the gods pleased. Life in these cities was no longer new or uncertain. Civilization had become something stable, something people expected to continue forever. And yet, the king list reminds us again and again that nothing stays the same. One of the most important moments in this later part of the story is the rise of the third dynasty of Ur, sometimes called the Ur-III period by historians today. This was a time when the city of Ur became the center of power once more, and its kings ruled over a large part of Mesopotamia. Unlike the earliest rulers in the list, these kings are known from many records. We know their names, we know the temples they built, and we even know details about their laws and their government. One of these kings was Ur-Nammu, a ruler whose name appears in inscriptions that still exist today. Ur-Nammu is remembered not only as a king, but as a builder and a lawgiver. He ordered the construction of great temples, including the famous ziggurat of Ur, and he created one of the oldest known law codes in history. Long before the laws of Babylon, long before the famous Code of Hammurabi, Ur-Nammu had already written rules about justice, punishment, and order. This tells us something important about how the idea of kingship had changed since the earliest part of the king list. In the beginning, kings were remembered almost like gods themselves, ruling for thousands of years in a world that felt half mythical. Now, kings were still chosen by the gods, but they were also responsible for keeping society organized. They had to make laws, build cities, and keep the peace. Their greatness was measured not only by legend, but by what they left behind. After Ur-Nammu came another king named Shulgi, one of the most powerful rulers of this period. The records about Shulgi describe him as strong, wise, and favored by the gods. He ruled for many years, longer than most kings of his time, and during his reign, the kingdom of Ur became rich and stable. Tablets from this era show a world that was highly organized, with officials keeping track of everything from grain supplies to the number of workers on a building project. Shulgi even had songs written about him, praising his strength and his devotion to the gods. In these songs, he is described almost like the kings of the old stories, as if the people wanted to believe that the greatness of the earliest age had returned. This is something that appears again and again in history. When a king becomes powerful, people begin to speak of him in the language of legend, connecting him to the heroes and rulers of the distant past. But just as the king list has shown from the beginning, no kingdom lasts forever. After the strong kings of Ur, the list begins to move again. The reigns grow shorter. The stability of the land begins to weaken. Enemies from outside Mesopotamia appear in the records, and the old cities struggle to hold their power. The scribes who copied the king list did not write long explanations for these changes. They simply wrote that kingship was taken away and given to another place, just as it had been so many times before. This quiet way of telling the story makes the fall of each kingdom feel almost inevitable, as if it was part of the same pattern that had begun long ago when the first kings ruled before the flood. Power rises, power fades, and kingship moves on. And as we continue further into the final parts of the king list, we begin to approach the end of the age of Sumer itself, a time when new peoples, new cities, and new kingdoms will appear, and the memory of the first kings will slowly turn into legend, even though the scribes never forgot that everything began when kingship first descended from heaven, in a time so distant that it almost feels like another world. As the Sumerian king list moves toward its later sections, the tone of the story becomes quieter, almost reflective, as if the scribes who copied these names understood that they were writing near the end of something very old. The great cities of Sumer had stood for centuries, rising from the mud of the river plains and growing into places filled with temples, markets, and walls strong enough to keep enemies away. For a long time, it must have seemed as if this world would continue forever. Yet the king list keeps repeating the same lesson it has whispered from the beginning. No city holds kingship forever. No ruler keeps power without end. The order of the world moves, slowly but always moving, like the rivers themselves. After the strong kings of the third dynasty of the records begin to show signs of change. The reigns grow shorter, the shifts of power become more frequent, and the list feels less stable than before. Where earlier kings ruled for many years, now some hold power only briefly before kingship is taken away and given somewhere else. The scribes do not describe the fear or confusion that people must have felt, but it is easy to imagine that the world no longer seemed as certain as it once had. The fall of marked the end of one of the last great periods of Sumerian dominance. The city that had built massive temples and written careful laws could not hold its power forever. Enemies from the east and north pressed into the land, trade routes changed, and the balance between the cities began to break. To the people who lived through this time, it may have felt as if the gods themselves had decided that the age of Sumer was ending, just as the king list always suggested could happen. After lost kingship, the list tells us that power moved again, this time to the city of Isin. Isin was not one of the oldest cities in the story, but it rose quickly after the fall of as if the wheel of kingship had turned once more. The rulers of Isin tried to present themselves as the true heirs of the old Sumerian tradition. They built temples, repaired canals, and wrote inscriptions that connected them to the kings who had ruled before them. By doing this, they were not only claiming power, they were claiming that the gods had chosen them to continue the line that began when kingship first descended from heaven. One of the interesting things about this period is that the world of Mesopotamia was becoming more complicated than it had been in earlier times. Instead of only Sumerian cities, new peoples and languages were appearing. The Akkadians, the Amorites, and other groups moved into the region, bringing their own traditions, their own gods, and their own rulers. Yet the old idea of kingship did not disappear. Even new kings wanted to show that they stood in the same line as the rulers of the past. Because of this, the king list does something very unusual. It keeps going, even as the world changes. It continues to record kings, cities, and reigns, as if the ancient pattern still mattered, even when the people living in the land were no longer the same as those who had built the first cities. After Isin, kingship moves again, this time to the city of Larsa. Larsa became powerful during a time when many cities competed for control of southern Mesopotamia. Tablets from this period show a world full of activity. Merchants traveled between cities. Farmers worked the fields beside the canals. Priests performed rituals in the temples just as they always had. Yet behind this ordinary life, there was constant tension, because no city could be sure how long its power would last. The kings of Larsa ruled for many years, and some of them became strong enough to challenge other cities for control of the land. Their inscriptions speak of victories, of building projects, and of devotion to the gods. Even though the world had changed since the earliest part of the king list, the language used by the kings stayed very similar. They still called themselves chosen by the gods. They still described their rule as something that had been given to them from above. The belief that kingship came from heaven was so deeply rooted that even new rulers in a changing world continued to repeat it. As we move further toward the end of the king list, another great city begins to rise, one that will become even more famous in later history. That city is Babylon. In the earliest parts of the list, Babylon is not important at all. It does not appear among the first cities, and it plays no role in the age before the flood. But by this later time, Babylon is growing stronger, slowly becoming one of the most powerful places in the region. The rise of Babylon shows how much the world had changed since the first kings of Sumer. The center of power was no longer fixed. It could move, just as it always had, but now it was moving into the hands of new peoples and new rulers. Still, the scribes who kept the king list did not see this as the end of the story. To them, it was simply another turn of the wheel. One of the reasons the king list feels so mysterious even today is that it never says the story is over. It does not end with a final king who rules forever. It simply continues until the time when the scribes themselves were living, as if to say that the chain of kingship would keep going as long as the world itself existed. When we look back at the beginning of the list, with its kings who lived for thousands of years and ruled before the flood, the later part feels very different. The numbers are smaller. The rulers are more human. The events are easier to understand. Yet the meaning behind the list stays the same from the first line to the last. Kingship comes from heaven. It moves when it must, and every ruler, no matter how powerful, is only part of a much longer story. For the Sumerians, this story was not just history. It was a way of understanding the world. It explained why cities rose and fell. It explained why disasters happened. It explained why no kingdom lasted forever. Everything followed the same pattern that had begun in the earliest age, when the first kings ruled in a time that felt closer to the gods than anything that came after. And as we continue toward the final names written on the king list, the feeling grows stronger that the scribes who copied these tablets were not only recording the past, but trying to hold on to it, preserving the memory of the first kings, the first cities, and the first age of the world, before time itself seemed to move faster and the distance between humans and the divine became greater than it had ever been before. As the Sumerian king list approaches its final sections, the feeling of the story changes again, becoming quieter and more reflective, almost as if the scribes who preserved these names understood that they were writing at the far end of a very long memory. The earliest parts of the list spoke of kings who ruled for thousands of years, of cities founded when the world itself felt new, and of a time before the flood when humans lived closer to the gods. Now the names belong to rulers whose lives were measured in ordinary years, in a world that looked much more like the one the scribes themselves knew. Yet even here, the list never forgets where the story began. By this time, the land of Mesopotamia was no longer only the land of Sumer. New peoples had arrived, new languages were spoken, and new kingdoms were rising. The old Sumerian cities still existed, but they were no longer alone. Amorite rulers, Akkadian speakers, and other groups had become part of the same world. Trade routes stretched farther than before, connecting the river cities to mountains, deserts, and distant coasts. The world felt larger, more complicated, and perhaps more uncertain than it had in the earliest age. The king list reflects this change in a subtle way. Instead of focusing only on the oldest cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, the later part includes places that had once been small or unimportant. This shows that kingship, as the Sumerians understood it, was never fixed in one place. It could move to any city the gods chose, even one that had not existed when the first kings ruled. During this later period, the city of Isin and the city of Larsa continued to struggle for power. For many years, these two cities competed to control the land of southern Mesopotamia. Tablets from this time show a world filled with careful records, written contracts, and detailed accounts of trade and farming. The people who lived then were not thinking about myth or legend in their daily lives. They were thinking about crops, taxes, work, and survival. Yet above all of this, the idea of kingship still carried the same sacred meaning it had always held. A king was not only the ruler of a city, he was the one who kept order between the human world and the world of the gods. If the temples were maintained, if the rituals were performed correctly, and if justice was kept, then the land would prosper. If something went wrong, people believed it meant the balance had been broken. As the list continues, the name of Babylon begins to appear more often, and this marks another important shift in the story. Babylon had once been a small city, not nearly as ancient as Eridu or Uruk, but now it was growing into something much larger. Its rulers began to claim authority over many cities at once, and they used the same language the Sumerian kings had used before them. They said that the gods had chosen them. They said that kingship had been given to them from heaven. One of the most famous rulers connected to this later age was Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, whose laws became known throughout the ancient world. The king list itself does not describe his life in detail, but his time belongs to the same long chain of kingship that the list records. Hammurabi is remembered today for his law code, carved into stone, where he wrote that the gods had given him the duty to bring justice to the land. What makes this so interesting is that the language used by Hammurabi sounds very similar to the language used by the earliest kings in the list. Even though thousands of years had passed since the age before the flood, the idea had not changed. A king ruled because the gods allowed him to rule. His job was to keep order in the world, just as the first kings had done when kingship first descended from heaven. By the time we reach the last names in the king list, the world feels fully historical. These are kings whose cities can be found, whose buildings have been uncovered, and whose tablets can still be read. Yet the list never separates them from the ancient past. The same chain connects them to Gilgamesh, to the kings of Kish, to the rulers of Eridu, and even to the first kings who were said to live before the flood. This is what makes the Sumerian king list so unusual. It is not only a record of rulers, it is a story about time itself. It shows how the people of Mesopotamia saw their world, not as something that began recently, but as something that stretched back into a past so distant, it almost felt sacred. In their minds, the first age of the world was different from the present. People lived longer, the gods were closer, cities were fewer, but they felt more important. As time passed, the world became more crowded, more complex, and more human. The kings became less like divine beings and more like ordinary rulers, yet they never lost the connection to the beginning. Another reason the king list feels mysterious is that it never explains everything. It does not tell us exactly why the flood happened. It does not explain why the earliest kings lived so long. It does not say why kingship moved from one city to another. It simply records that these things happened, as if the scribes believed the pattern itself was enough, and that the deeper reasons were known only to the gods. For the people who wrote these tablets, the king list was not just history. It was proof that the world had an order, even if humans could not always understand it. When a city rose, it was because the time had come. When a city fell, it was because the time had passed. When a king ruled, it was because kingship had been given to him, just as it had been given to the first rulers long ago. As we move closer to the end of the list, the feeling grows stronger that the scribes were trying to preserve something that they knew was already fading. The old Sumerian world was changing, New kingdoms were rising, new languages were spoken, but by writing the names of the kings in one long line, they could show that the story had never truly been broken. From the first ruler in Eridu, to the kings after the flood, to the rulers of Ur, Akkad, Isin, Larsa, and Babylon, everything belonged to the same chain. A chain that began when kingship first came down from heaven, and that continued through every age, even as the world itself became more ordinary, more human, and farther from the time when the first kings were said to rule for thousands of years under the watchful eyes of the gods. And as the list comes closer to its end, it leaves us with the strange feeling that history, myth, and memory were never meant to be separated, but were always part of the same story. A story that the Sumerians believed would continue as long as there were cities, as long as there were kings, and as long as the heavens still watched over the earth. As the Sumerian king list reaches its final stretch, the feeling becomes almost peaceful, as if the long journey through time is slowly coming to rest. The earliest parts of the list spoke of a world that feels distant and dreamlike, filled with kings who ruled for thousands of years and cities that existed when the earth itself seemed young. Now the names belong to rulers who lived in a world much closer to the one we understand, a world of laws, trade, armies, and written records. Yet even at the end, the same quiet idea remains unchanged. Kingship came from heaven, and every ruler, no matter how ordinary he seemed, stood in a line that reached all the way back to the beginning. By the time the last sections of the king list were written and copied, the world of Mesopotamia had become a place of many kingdoms, many languages, and many traditions. The old Sumerian cities were still remembered, but they were no longer alone at the center of the world. Babylon had risen to power, and other cities would rise after it. The rivers still flowed, the fields were still planted, and the temples still stood. But the age when Sumer ruled the land had slowly passed into memory. For the scribes who preserved the king list, this did not mean the story was over. Instead, it meant that the story had grown longer. Each new king was added to the chain, just as the kings before him had been. The list did not end with a great final ruler who held power forever. It simply continued until it reached the present time of the people who were writing it, as if to say that history itself was still moving, still unfolding, still following the same pattern that had begun when kingship first descended from heaven. One of the most interesting things about the end of the king list is how calm it feels compared to the beginning. The early kings ruled for impossible lengths of time, and the world before the flood felt mysterious and almost supernatural. But the later kings live normal lives, rule for ordinary years, and leave behind records that sound like real history. It is as if the list itself is showing the slow change from a mythical age into a human one. Some historians believe this was exactly the point. The scribes who wrote the list may have wanted to show that the world had moved through different ages. In the first age, the gods were close, and the kings were almost divine. After the flood, the world became more human, and the kings became more like ordinary rulers. By the time the scribes were writing, the distance between heaven and earth felt greater than ever, but the connection was still there. This idea appears in many ancient cultures. There is often a story about a golden age in the beginning, when people lived longer and the world was closer to perfection. Then, slowly, the world changes. Lifespans grow shorter. Kingdoms become more complicated. Life becomes harder. The Sumerian king list seems to follow this same pattern, starting in a time that feels almost like legend and ending in a time that feels like history. Even though the later kings were more human, they still believed they were chosen by the gods. Inscriptions from this period often begin with the same words, saying that the king was called by a god, or given power by a goddess, or placed on the throne by divine will. This shows how strong the old belief remained, even after thousands of years. The idea that kingship came from heaven was never forgotten. Another reason the king list feels so mysterious today is that it mixes things we can confirm with things we cannot fully explain. We know the cities were real. We know the kings existed. We know the tablets were written. But the earliest part of the list still raises questions. Why were the first kings said to live so long? Why does the story speak of a flood that destroyed the world? Why does kingship move from city to city as if guided by something unseen? Some people believe these stories were only symbolic, a way for the Sumerians to explain the past in a language that made sense to them. Others wonder if the list preserves memories of events that really happened long ago, remembered in a way that became more legendary with time. And some simply see the list as a reflection of how ancient people understood the world, where history, religion, and myth were never separated the way they are today. What makes the king list so powerful is not just the names it contains, but the feeling it leaves behind. It gives the sense that human history is part of something much older and much larger than we usually imagine. The scribes who wrote these tablets did not think of themselves as living at the beginning of civilization. They believed they were living near the end of a story that had already lasted for thousands of years. When they wrote the names of the first kings, the ones who ruled before the flood, those rulers must have felt as distant to them as the first humans feel to us now. Yet they still believed the connection was real. They believed that the same kingship that began in Eridu, when the gods first gave order to the world, was still the same kingship that existed in their own time. As the final names in the king list are written, there is no sudden ending, no final line that says the story is finished. It simply stops, as if the scribes expected the list to continue, as if they believed that as long as cities existed, as long as rulers sat on thrones, the chain would go on. From the first king who ruled for tens of thousands of years, to the later rulers who governed real kingdoms of brick and stone, every name belongs to the same long memory. A memory of a world that began in mystery, passed through flood and legend, and slowly became the history we think we know. And when we read the king list today, thousands of years later, it still carries that same quiet feeling, that the past is deeper than it looks, that the first age of the world may have been stranger than we can imagine, and that the story of the Sumerian kings was never only about rulers, but about the belief that order itself came from the heavens, and that every generation lives somewhere between the earth below and the sky above. As the long story of the Sumerian kings continues to unfold, the feeling becomes softer, almost like looking back through layers of time that grow more distant with every step. By now, the names in the king list belong to rulers who lived in a world that feels closer to history than legend. Yet the memory of the earliest age never disappears. The scribes who copied these tablets lived in a time when cities were already ancient, when temples had been rebuilt many times, and when the stories of the first kings were as old to them as the oldest stories are to us today. What makes the king list so fascinating is that it was not written all at once. It was copied and rewritten by different scribes across many generations. Each time it was written again, the past became a little more distant, but the structure of the story stayed the same. Kingship still descended from heaven. The flood still divided the earliest age from the world that came after. The cities still rose and fell in the same repeating pattern. It was as if the scribes believed that even if the world changed, the order behind it never did. By the later periods, the people living in Mesopotamia were surrounded by the remains of older civilizations. Ruins of ancient temples stood beside newer ones. Broken walls from forgotten cities lay buried under the ground. When builders dug foundations for new structures, they sometimes found bricks stamped with the names of kings who had lived hundreds or even thousands of years before. To them, the past was not something far away. It was right beneath their feet. Because of this, the stories of the earliest kings must have felt both mysterious and real at the same time. When the king list spoke of rulers who lived for thousands of years, the scribes may not have seen this as impossible. They may have believed the world itself was different in those first ages, closer to the time when the gods created order out of chaos. The flood marked the moment when that first age ended, and everything after it belonged to a world that was less perfect, more human, and more uncertain. During the later centuries, the tradition of writing king lists continued even as new kingdoms rose. Babylon became powerful, then other cities followed. The Assyrians in the north began to grow stronger, building their own cities and recording their own histories. Yet the old Sumerian way of thinking about kingship never completely vanished. Even rulers who did not speak the Sumerian language still used the same ideas, saying that the gods had chosen them, that they ruled by divine will, and that their power was part of an order older than any one kingdom. This tells us something important about the king list. It was not only a record of Sumerian rulers, it became a model for how people in Mesopotamia understood history itself. A king was not just someone who won battles or inherited a throne. A king was part of a line that went back to the beginning of civilization. To rule meant to stand inside that line, connected to every ruler who had come before. Another detail that makes the king list so unusual is how calm it feels, even when it describes the fall of cities or the end of dynasties. There are no long explanations, no dramatic speeches, no stories of fear or panic. The text simply says that kingship was taken to another place. This gives the whole list a feeling of inevitability, as if the scribes believed that everything happened according to a pattern that could not be stopped. When modern historians read the king list, they often try to separate what is real from what is legend. They look for the names that appear in other records, the cities that have been excavated, the dates that can be confirmed. This helps us understand the historical part of the list, but it does not explain why the list was written the way it was. The scribes were not trying to write history the way we do today. They were trying to show that the world had a structure, and that structure began in the distant past. The idea that the earliest kings lived longer than later ones may have been a way of showing that the first age of the world was more perfect. In many ancient traditions, time does not begin in an ordinary way. It begins in a golden age, when life is longer, the gods are closer, and the world is more ordered. As time passes, things become less stable, and people become more human. The king list seems to follow this same idea, moving from the age before the flood to the age after it, and then slowly into the time of real history. Another possibility that some researchers consider is that the long lifespans in the earliest part of the list were connected to sacred numbers. The Sumerians used a number system based on 60, and many of the reign lengths in the list are exact multiples of numbers that were considered special. This suggests that the numbers may have been symbolic, meant to show importance rather than actual years. Even if this is true, the scribes still believed the first kings belonged to a time very different from their own. As the king list reaches its later names, the sense of mystery does not disappear, but it becomes quieter. The kings are human, the cities are real, and the events feel closer to something we can understand. Yet the connection to the beginning is never broken. Every ruler is still part of the same chain that started in Eridu, when kingship first descended from heaven. For the people who lived in Mesopotamia, this idea must have been comforting in a way. Even when kingdoms fell, even when new rulers came from far away, the order of the world still existed. Kingship could move, but it never vanished. The chain continued, linking the present to the distant past. When we read the king list today, we are not only reading about ancient rulers, we are reading about how one of the oldest civilizations in the world understood time, power, and the place of humans in the universe. They believed the world had a beginning that was sacred, a middle that was uncertain, and a future that would keep unfolding as long as the gods allowed it. And as the list moves closer to its final names, the feeling grows stronger that the scribes who preserved these tablets were not only recording history, but trying to keep the memory of the First Age alive, so that even in a changing world, people would remember that everything began in a time when the first kings ruled under the sky, when the gods were closer to the earth, and when the story of civilization had only just begun. As the story of the Sumerian kings continues toward its final chapters, the feeling becomes slower, almost as if time itself is stretching out behind us. We have traveled from the age before the flood, through the rise of the first cities, through the time of legendary rulers, and into the era when kings left behind records that can still be read today. The further we go, the more the world begins to look familiar, yet the presence of the distant past never disappears. Every name in the king list still belongs to the same chain that began when kingship first descended from heaven. By the time the later copies of the king list were written, the people of Mesopotamia were living in a world filled with layers of history. Old cities stood on top of even older cities. Temples had been rebuilt again and again on the same sacred ground. When scribes wrote the names of the kings, they were not only writing about rulers, they were writing about a past that surrounded them everywhere they looked. It is easy to imagine a scribe sitting in a quiet room inside a temple, pressing signs into wet clay with a reed stylus, carefully copying the same lines that had been written generations before. He may not have known exactly how long ago the first kings lived, but he believed they were real. He believed the flood had happened. He believed that kingship truly came from the gods. And by writing the list again, he was helping to keep the order of the world intact. During these later centuries, the political world of Mesopotamia continued to change. Cities rose and fell, new dynasties appeared, and new rulers tried to prove that they were the rightful heirs of the ancient tradition. Even when the Sumerian language was no longer spoken in everyday life, it was still used in temples and in writing, because it carried the weight of the past. To write in Sumerian was to connect yourself to the oldest age of civilization. The king list itself may have been used for this reason. By showing that the current king stood in the same line as the first rulers of Eridu, it gave him legitimacy. It showed that his power was not new, not temporary, but part of something that had existed since the beginning of the world. In a time when many cities competed for control, this idea was very important. A king who could claim the ancient line of kingship was stronger than one who could only claim victory in battle. As we move through the final sections of the list, the reigns become shorter and the names feel closer together, as if the pace of history has quickened. In the earliest part, thousands of years could pass between one king and the next. Now, the changes happen within lifetimes. Fathers are followed by sons. Dynasties rise and fall within a few generations. The world feels more human, more fragile, and more uncertain. Yet the king list never changes its tone. It never says that the world has become worse, or that the past was better. It simply continues to record the movement of kingship, as if the pattern itself is the only thing that matters. Whether a king ruled for thousands of years or only a few, he was still part of the same order. One of the most interesting things about the later period of Mesopotamian history is how strongly people still believed in the connection between the king and the divine. Even when kingdoms became large and complicated, rulers continued to describe themselves as chosen by the gods. They built temples, offered sacrifices, and performed rituals to show that they were worthy of their position. If disaster struck, the king might perform ceremonies to ask forgiveness, believing that the balance between heaven and earth had been disturbed. This belief helps explain why the king list was preserved for so long. It was not only a historical record, it was a reminder that order in the world depended on the right relationship between humans and the gods. As long as kingship existed, the world continued. If kingship were ever lost completely, the world itself might fall back into chaos. When we look at the earliest part of the list, with its kings who lived for tens of thousands of years, it feels almost impossible to connect that world to the later one. But the scribes did not see a break between them. To them, it was all the same story, just different ages of the same world. The flood marked the end of the first age, but it did not end kingship. The rise of new cities changed the map, but it did not break the chain. Even when new peoples came into Mesopotamia, they stepped into the same tradition, using the same titles, building the same temples, and claiming the same divine approval that the earliest kings had claimed. This idea that history moves in cycles, rather than in a straight line, appears again and again in ancient thought. A city rises, grows strong, becomes proud, and then falls. Another city rises in its place. The pattern repeats, but the chain of kingship continues. The king list feels like a record of this cycle, written slowly over centuries, each generation adding its own names to the end. As the list approaches its final entries, there is a sense that the scribes knew they were living far from the beginning. The first kings belonged to a time so distant, it almost felt sacred. The later kings lived in a world that was more ordinary, more crowded, and more uncertain. Yet the connection to the beginning was never lost, because every ruler was still part of the same line. When we read the king list today, it feels like listening to a voice from the oldest part of human memory. It speaks of floods, of cities that no longer exist, of rulers whose lives seem impossible, and of a belief that the world has an order that stretches back to the moment when the first kings were given their power by the heavens. And as we continue toward the final names written on the tablet, the story begins to feel less like a list of rulers and more like a long, quiet reminder that every age believes itself to be the present, but every present eventually becomes the past, joining the same chain that began in a time when the first cities were new, the first temples were rising, and the first kings were said to rule under the watchful eyes of the gods. As the Sumerian king list moves into its final names, the story begins to feel less like a record of rulers and more like a long echo of memory, stretching back across thousands of years. By this point, the scribes who copied these tablets were living in a world very different from the one described at the beginning of the list. The age of the first cities was long past. The great kings of Sumer had come and gone, and new kingdoms now ruled the land between the rivers. Yet the list continued to be written, copied, and preserved, as if the people who kept it believed that the story of kingship could never truly end. One of the most remarkable things about the king list is that it keeps the same calm tone from the first line to the last. It does not show fear when cities fall, and it does not show excitement when new kings rise. It simply records that kingship moved, that another ruler took the throne, and that the order of the world continued. This gives the entire list a feeling of something steady and unbroken, even though the events it describes must have been full of conflict, change, and uncertainty. By the later periods, Mesopotamia had become a land where many different cultures lived side by side. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Amorites, and others all shared the same rivers, the same fields, and often the same cities. Languages changed, gods were worshipped under different names, and new rulers came from places that had once been far away. But the idea of kingship as something sacred remained the same. Even new kings who did not belong to the old Sumerian cities still claimed that their power came from the heavens. This shows how strong the old tradition was. The king list may have begun as a record of Sumerian rulers, but it became something larger than that. It became a way of understanding history itself. No matter who ruled, they were part of the same chain that began when kingship first descended from heaven. As the final sections of the list are written, the reigns are short, the names are closer together, and the story feels more like the world we know. Kings rule for years, not centuries. Dynasties last for generations, not ages. Cities rise because of power and fall because of war. Yet the list never says that the earlier stories were wrong. It never says the first kings were only legends. Instead, it keeps them at the beginning, as if to remind every reader that the world did not always look the way it does now. For the people who preserved the king list, the past was not something to be doubted. It was something to be respected. The earliest age was closer to the time when the gods created order, and because of that, it felt more important than the present. Even if the numbers seemed impossible, the meaning behind them was clear. The first kings belonged to a time when the world was different, when humans stood closer to the divine. Another reason the list was preserved may have been because it gave comfort in uncertain times. When kingdoms changed and new rulers appeared, the king list showed that this had always happened. Cities had risen and fallen before, and the world had continued. Kingship had moved again and again, but it had never disappeared. As long as the chain continued, the order of the world remained. This idea must have been powerful for people who lived through periods of war or invasion. Even if their own city fell, they could believe that kingship would return somewhere else, just as it always had. The story of the past showed that change was not the end. It was part of the pattern. By the time the last names in the king list were written, the scribes were already living in a world that felt far from the beginning. The age of the flood was unimaginably distant. The first kings of Eridu belonged to a time almost beyond memory. Yet the list kept their names at the start, as if the entire history of civilization rested on that first moment when kingship came down from heaven. When we read the king list today, it can feel strange that the earliest rulers are described as living for tens of thousands of years. Modern thinking tells us that cannot be true. But the list was never meant to be read the way we read history today. It was meant to show that time itself had depth, that the world had passed through different ages, and that the beginning was more mysterious than the present. In many ways, the king list is not only about kings, it is about how humans try to understand where they come from. Every civilization looks back and wonders what the world was like at the start. The Sumerians answered that question by telling a story of divine kings, a great flood, and a long line of rulers that connected the first city to the last. As the final names are written, the story does not end with a great conclusion. It simply stops, as if the scribes expected that more names would be added later. This makes the list feel unfinished, but in a peaceful way. It suggests that history never truly ends. It only continues, one ruler after another, one city after another, always following the same pattern that began in the earliest age. And when we reach the end of the tablet, we are left with the same quiet thought that must have stayed with the people who first wrote these lines. That the world is older than it looks, that the past is deeper than we remember, and that long before our time, long before the empires we know, there were kings whose names were pressed into clay so they would not be forgotten, rulers who belonged to a chain that stretched all the way back to the moment when the first throne was placed upon the earth under the wide and watchful sky. As the Sumerian king list nears its final lines, the story begins to feel almost like a quiet fading of light at the end of a very long day. We have traveled from the earliest age, when the first kings ruled before the flood, through the rise of the first cities, through wars, empires, and generations of rulers, all the way to a time when the world had become familiar, crowded, and deeply layered with history. Yet even now, at the far end of the list, the same idea remains unchanged. Kingship still exists, and as long as it exists, the order of the world continues. The scribes who copied the last versions of the king list lived in a time when the ancient Sumerian cities were already old. Some had fallen into ruin, others had been rebuilt many times, and new centers of power had appeared that did not exist when the first lines of the list were written. But the scribes did not see this as the end of the story. To them, the past was not something that disappeared. It stayed alive through memory, through writing, and through the belief that the same chain of kingship connected every age. When we think about the people who preserved these tablets, it is easy to imagine them working slowly and carefully, copying each sign into clay, making sure the names were not lost. Writing in Mesopotamia was not simple. Every symbol had to be pressed by hand, and every mistake meant starting again. The fact that the king list was copied again and again shows that it was considered important, not only as history, but as something that held meaning for the present. By the time the later kings were added to the list, the world had changed many times. The Sumerian language was no longer spoken by everyone, but it was still used in temples and schools because it carried the authority of the past. To write in Sumerian was to speak in the voice of the first cities, the first kings, and the first age of civilization. The king list itself became part of that tradition, something that connected the present to the beginning. One of the reasons the list feels so unusual today is that it never tries to separate myth from history. The kings before the flood stand in the same line as the kings of Ur, the kings of Akkad, and the rulers of later cities. To the scribes, this was natural. They did not see the past as something divided into categories. They saw it as one long story, with different ages that slowly changed but never broke apart. In the earliest age, the world was closer to the gods. The kings lived longer, the cities were fewer, and the order of the world felt stronger. After the flood, life became more uncertain. Cities fought each other, power moved from place to place, and rulers became more human. By the time the last kings were written down, the world had become complicated, full of different peoples and kingdoms, yet the belief in divine kingship remained the same. This slow change from a mythical age to a historical one may have been exactly what the scribes wanted to show. The king list feels like a memory of time itself, beginning in a sacred past and moving step by step into the present. It reminds the reader that the world did not always look the way it does now, and that the first age of civilization was something special, something closer to the moment when order was first created. Another reason the list may have been preserved for so long is that it gave rulers a way to prove that their power was rightful. A king who could say that he stood in the same line as the rulers of Eridu and Kish was not just another leader. He was part of the same tradition that began when kingship descended from heaven. In a land where cities often competed for control, this connection to the past could make the difference between being seen as a true king or only a temporary ruler. As the last names in the king list are written, the reigns feel short compared to the earliest ones, but they still carry the same meaning. Each king holds power for a time, then kingship moves on. The pattern never changes. It is as if the list itself is telling us that the details of each reign are less important than the fact that the chain continues. When we look back to the beginning, the story seems almost unbelievable. Kings ruling for tens of thousands of years. A flood that resets the world. Cities founded when the earth itself felt new. But when we reach the end, the story feels closer to something we understand. And yet, the list never says the beginning was wrong. It keeps the earliest kings in their place, as if the truth of the past is not only about facts, but about meaning. For the people who lived in Mesopotamia, the king list showed that history had a shape. It began in mystery, passed through change, and continued into the present. Every generation stood somewhere in the middle of that shape. looking back at the first kings and forward to rulers who had not yet been born. As the final lines of the list approach, there is a quiet feeling that the scribes knew the story would not stop with them. New kings would come, new cities would rise, the world would keep turning, just as it always had. The list did not need to say this directly. It simply ended, leaving space for the future, just as earlier scribes had left space for the present. And in that silence at the end of the tablet, there is the same thought that has followed us from the very beginning of the story, that the world is older than we can easily imagine, that the first age may have been stranger than anything we know, and that long before our time, when the first cities stood beside the rivers and the first temples reached toward the sky, the people of Sumer believed that kingship itself was a gift from the heavens, placed into human hands for a while, then passed on again, again, and again, as the endless story of civilization continued under the slow and watchful turning of the stars. As we move into the final part of the long story of the Sumerian kings, the feeling becomes softer, almost like the world itself is settling into silence after thousands of years of change. We have followed the line of rulers from the first age, when kingship was said to descend from heaven, through the time before the flood, through the rise of cities, the building of temples, the wars between kingdoms, and the slow transformation of the world into something more familiar. And now, as the king list reaches its last names, the story does not end with a sudden moment, but with the quiet sense that history simply continues, one generation after another. By the time the final versions of the king list were written, the scribes who preserved it were already living far from the beginning. The first kings of Eridu belonged to a past so distant that it must have felt almost sacred. The flood, the long rains, the early cities, all of it was part of a memory that stretched beyond anything they could see with their own eyes. Yet they still believed that memory mattered, because it showed that the world had an order, and that order had never truly been broken. The later kings in the list ruled in a world that was more crowded, more complex, and more uncertain than the one described at the start. New peoples had come into the land, new languages were spoken, new kingdoms rose where old ones had fallen. But the idea of kingship stayed the same. Every ruler still claimed that his power came from the gods. Every city still believed it had been chosen for a reason. And every generation still looked back to the first age, wondering what the world had been like when the first kings ruled under the open sky. One of the reasons the king list feels so peaceful, even when it describes the fall of cities, is that it never treats change as the end. When one dynasty ends, another begins. When one city loses kingship, another receives it. The list moves forward without fear, as if the scribes believed that the pattern itself was stronger than any single kingdom. As long as kingship existed somewhere, the world was still in order. This way of thinking tells us something important about how the people of ancient Mesopotamia saw time. They did not see history as a straight line with a beginning and an end. They saw it as something that moved in cycles. Power rises, power fades, and power rises again. The names change, the cities change, but the pattern stays the same. The king list is like a record of those cycles, written slowly across centuries, each generation adding its own place in the chain. When modern historians study the king list, they often try to separate the parts that can be proven from the parts that sound impossible. They look for the kings whose names appear on other tablets, the cities whose ruins have been found, the dates that can be compared with other records. This helps us understand the historical world of Mesopotamia, but it does not fully explain the meaning of the list. The scribes who wrote it were not only trying to record events, they were trying to show that the world had a structure, and that structure began long before their own time. The kings before the flood may not have lived for thousands of years in the way we measure time today, But their place at the beginning of the story showed that the first age of the world was different, closer to the moment when order was first created. In many ancient traditions, the past becomes more mysterious the farther back you go. The earliest time is often seen as a golden age, when humans lived longer, the gods were closer, and the world was more perfect. The Sumerian king list follows this same idea. It begins in a time that feels almost like myth, then slowly moves into history, until the kings seem like ordinary rulers living in a world we can recognize. Yet the list never says that the golden age was gone completely. It keeps the connection alive by placing every king in the same line. Even the latest ruler is still linked to the first king of Eridu, still part of the same chain that began when kingship descended from heaven. Another reason the king list survived for so long may be that it gave people a sense of stability in a world that often felt uncertain. When wars happened, when cities were destroyed, when new rulers came from far away, the list showed that this had happened before. The world had changed many times, but the order behind it remained. For the scribes who copied the last versions of the list, writing these names may have felt like holding on to something ancient and important. Each sign pressed into the clay connected them to generations of writers who had done the same thing before. Each name reminded them that their own time was only one small part of a much longer story. As the final entries are written, the list does not try to explain everything. It does not tell us why the first kings lived so long. It does not tell us exactly why the flood happened. It does not say why kingship moved from one city to another. It simply records that these things were part of the world, just as real to the scribes as the rivers and the temples around them. And when the list finally comes to its last name, there is no grand ending. There is only a quiet stop, as if the story could continue at any time, as if another scribe might one day add another king to the chain. This makes the king list feel less like a finished book and more like a memory that never fully closes. From the first ruler who was said to reign for tens of thousands of years, to the later kings who lived in cities of brick and stone, every name belongs to the same long line. A line that begins in mystery, passes through flood and legend, and reaches into history without ever breaking. And as we come close to the end of this journey through the kings of Sumer, the story leaves us with the same quiet thought that must have stayed with the people who first wrote these tablets. That the world is older than it seems, that the past is deeper than we remember, and that long before our time, when the first cities stood beside the rivers and the first temples rose toward the sky, there were rulers who believed their power came from the heavens, and that as long as kingship continued, the order of the world would continue with it. And now, as the long story of the Sumerian kings finally comes to rest, the feeling is not of an ending, but of a slow fading into the distance, like the last light of evening disappearing beyond the horizon. We have followed the line of rulers from the earliest age, when the first kings were said to reign before the flood, through the rise of the first cities beside the rivers, through the building of temples, the wars of rival kingdoms, the growth of empires, and the quiet passing of power from one city to another. And through all of it, one idea never changed. Kingship came from heaven, and as long as kingship remained, the world itself remained in order. For the people who first wrote the Sumerian king list, this was not only a story about rulers, it was a story about time, about memory, and about the belief that the present was only one small part of a much larger pattern. They believed the world had begun in a sacred age, when the gods were closer to the earth and the first kings ruled for lengths of time that seem impossible to us now. Then came the flood, the great dividing line between the earliest age and the world that followed. After that, cities rose and fell, dynasties changed, and generations passed, but the chain of kingship continued without ever breaking. When we look at the king list today, thousands of years after it was written, it is easy to focus on the strange details. The kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, the flood that reset the world, the idea that power moved from city to city because of the will of the gods. But for the people who preserved these tablets, those things were not strange. They were part of how the world made sense. In their minds, history was not only about events, it was about order. The rivers flowed in their paths. The seasons returned each year. The stars moved across the sky in patterns that never changed. And just like those things, kingship followed its own pattern, given by the heavens, passed from one ruler to the next, continuing through every age. The scribes who copied the king list lived in a world where the ruins of older cities stood all around them. Broken walls, buried temples, bricks stamped with the names of kings who had lived centuries before. When they wrote the names of the earliest rulers, they were not inventing a story. They were trying to hold on to a memory, to keep the past alive so that the order of the world would not be forgotten. It must have felt strange even to them, writing the names of kings who were said to live for thousands of years. Those rulers belonged to a time so distant that it almost felt like another world. Yet the scribes placed those names at the beginning of the list, because the story had to begin there. Without the first kings, the later ones would have no place in the chain. As the centuries passed, new kingdoms rose, new languages were spoken, and new rulers took power. But the idea behind the king list never disappeared. Even kings who were not Sumerian still claimed that the gods had chosen them. Even rulers of great empires still built temples and offered sacrifices, just as the earliest kings had done. The belief that power came from the heavens lasted longer than any city, longer than any dynasty, longer even than the memory of the First Age itself. One of the quietest but most powerful things about the king list is the way it ends. There is no final king who rules forever. There is no moment where the story says that the chain is complete. It simply stops, as if the scribes knew that history would go on without them. Another king could always be added. Another city could always rise. The pattern would continue, just as it always had. And maybe that is why the list was written the way it was. Not to tell us exactly what happened, but to remind us that the world has always been changing, and that every generation believes it is living in the present, even though one day it will become part of the past. When we think about the first kings of Sumer now, it is hard to imagine a time so far away. A time when the first cities stood beside the rivers, when writing was new, when people believed the gods walked close to the earth. Yet those people believed their own past was even older, even deeper, reaching back to an age when the first rulers were placed on their thrones by the heavens themselves. And in a quiet way, the king list invites us to feel the same thing, to look back and wonder how far the story really goes, to imagine that before the history we know, there may have been other ages, other beginnings, other moments when the world felt new. So tonight, as the names of the Sumerian kings fade into the distance, you can let your mind drift with them, back along the rivers of ancient Mesopotamia, past the ruins of Ur and Uruk, past the temples of forgotten gods, past the flood that divided the ages, all the way to the first city, the first throne, the first moment when kingship was said to descend from heaven. And as the story slowly settles into silence, you can let the thought rest gently in the background, like the steady flow of the rivers themselves, that long before our time, long before the world we know, there were people who looked up at the same sky, watched the same stars, and believed that the story of humanity was part of something endless, something that began in mystery, continued through every age, and will keep going quietly long after we have fallen asleep.